Open your phone and look at the applications that you actually use. Most of them are probably available in other languages. It's not something that we usually think about, but it's super important. Internationalization of your application is important if you want to make your product accessible to more people. This doesn't just mean people in other countries, but this also is important for people whose native language isn't English. If you're an engineer that's tasked with adding translations to your application, or you're someone interested in learning how localization of a product works, stick around. In the next few minutes, I'm going to be teaching you things that I know about localizations, how you might get started, and some nuances to look for. For a lot of these concepts, I'm going to be using examples with JavaScript libraries, but most of what I'm teaching can probably be done in other languages. I just know JavaScript best, so that's what I'm going to be using. First, I'm going to talk about straight up text localization, and then I'll go into things like number formatting, which includes things like date localization, number localization, and currency localization. At its basics, your service or application will have a key string to work with and a locale to work with to produce a completely translated string. You might also have number formatting or variables and stuff, but I'll touch on that later. This key is something that you define. So imagine that I wanted to have an application with colors like red, blue, and green. This is probably how I would define the colors in a key value format. The locale will come from a user setting somewhere that maybe you've saved based on the user, or maybe it comes from the browser or device. As far as I've seen for this, what's most commonly used for this locale is the IETF BCP47 standard. The result will be produced with some service that takes in all the translations from somewhere and spits out the results. So where do these translations actually come from? Well, you can either find a friend who knows the language well enough to translate it, or you can just pay people to translate it for you. I personally don't know what the best service is for this, but I'm sure that you can find your own solution that fits within your budget. So once you actually have these translations, next you're going to want to figure out how to store it. Honestly, there's so many ways to actually go about this. For example, if you have a large team and you need to add a bunch of strings to get translated, what's the best way for your engineers to do that? Maybe you want to have your own service where engineers can type in translation keys and the English versions of the strings, and then you send that off to get translated. Or maybe you want to keep everything in a repo. I personally don't know what companies actually do for this, but I'm sure that you can think of a solution that you can expand on in the future. So now it's time to actually use the strings. Now, if your application doesn't have many strings to translate, you can probably just grab them all and bundle them in the front end or keep them in the memory on the back end. But if there's a ton of strings, you'd be surprised at how much space these strings actually take up. You'll want to think about how to split them up, either with code splitting different locales, using Webpack code splitting, or by using dynamic imports or caching on the back end. I won't be going into how to do those, so if that's important for your use case, that's some homework that you're going to have to do. One of the best JavaScript libraries that I personally know of that will work both on the back end and the front end is i18next. I'm sure similar solutions exist for other coding languages, so I'll just give you a few examples of the usages for i18next. It's honestly a simple library, so you can probably just implement your own version of the library if it doesn't exist. So how it works is it takes in your language code in the IETF BCP47 standard that I previously mentioned, and it also takes in all the translations in a JSON format. Then you just use it in your code. It's super simple, but there's some tricks to it that I think will make using it more effective that you may not have thought about. Trick number one, when using this, don't actually rely on strings for the BCP47 standard. Create an enum or a map for it so that the variables are actually set in stone here and they have no room for changes. Sometimes we may unintentionally capitalize parts of the language code or make a typo somewhere, which causes issues because the codes are case sensitive. Namespacing things can actually be super important depending on the scale of your application. If you've had an application that shows colors to your user and maybe you wanted to have a whole segment of your application dedicated to primary colors versus secondary colors, you might choose to segment those under separate namespaces. This is good for if there are multiple different teams working on different translations so they don't step on each other's toes or make bundle sizes too large, because as your application grows, the amount of strings will grow and become unwieldy for one service to hold all the localization, depending on if you have a monolith versus a microservice architecture. Plural forms. i18next actually supports plural forms of strings. I don't have experience with it a lot, so I can't say much about it, but it's definitely something that you should read into depending on your use case. Pseudo-lock. Something to be aware of is that strings in different languages might be longer. I'll give you this example that Netflix Engineering had for a string in German. Look how much longer it actually is. What you want to do is be able to test this for every single case you can think of. Switching languages might work for some of these use cases, but the best way to test this is just to make a fake language that makes the string super long. Pseudo-lock was invented for this very purpose. I'll leave a link below for Netflix Engineering's blog post about it so you can learn more. Numbers are formatted differently in different languages. Some languages might use a period where we in the English language use a comma. Some even use spaces. How do we even manage all of this? Well, that's where standards come in to save us again. Honestly, I haven't done a lot of research into which standard is the absolute best to use, but I've been using precedent that I found to determine what I think is what should be used. The Unicode Common Locale Data Repository, or CLDR for short, is a giant information haven for common standards like language names, currency names, and a bunch of different formatting stuff. BCP 47 is a subset of CLDR as far as I know. I know that for things like currency formatting, this standard is something that's used by the Angular project. So at least we know it's trustworthy for one of the largest JavaScript frameworks ever. Plus, at some point, you can't really do more research on things before going down a rabbit hole of what has the best support for different locales. For most cases, I found that using the International Number Formatting Library is good enough for most use cases relating to numbers. And the moment or the date library is good enough for date formatting. And these are on the front end. For the back end, you can also get versions of that and just import it into your application. And here's how to use them. It's pretty much that easy. Now, in other programming languages, you're going to have to do your own research to determine which is the best library, or maybe somebody probably already did the research and has a great open source library for you to use. You'll definitely want to read the APIs for these to understand more. And in some cases, you might want to do something special and combine certain cases. For example, one niche area in currency formatting is to use the letter codes instead of the number symbols. Sometimes you want the symbol in all cases, regardless of the language, or you want a user-defined symbol to appear, but use the number formatting. In this case, you really want to dig into the CLDR data to figure out things like the symbol position, the use cases for it, and to produce your own data for it. Or sometimes the library can be wrong. If localization is imperative to your application, you want to keep track of updates to standards to bring it up to the rest of your team. One example that I can think of was a previous version of Chromium actually didn't have the correct number formatting for Norwegian. This might not seem like a huge deal. Most people probably have the latest version of Chromium anyways, right? Sure, but I'm thinking about this more in terms of a developer. Puppeteer is a library that runs unit tests sometimes. It uses the latest version of Headless Chrome, which uses Chromium under the hood. Locally, your tests for Norwegian might work because when you install Puppeteer, it installs the latest version of Chromium. But when you put it on a Docker container for continuous integration, Puppeteer relies on Chromium to be installed through the Docker file. If you use a version of Chromium before something like 82, I don't remember it off the top of my head, nor when I was writing the script, some form of Norwegian will be wrong and your pipeline's gonna fail. You're gonna wonder what's going on. So you wanna keep track of these things just to make sure everything's fully fleshed out and perfect. Now, what I just mentioned outlines that you should have unit tests for these things too. You might think that maybe you don't have a lot of Norwegian customers, but I argue that if you're going to be doing this work for localization, you might as well do it right the first time. I write unit tests for different locales based on the data that I straight up pull from the CLDR repository. There's actually an NPM package that exists that makes this easy to write scripts for. So those are some of the localization tricks that I've learned from my time in industry as well as personal research. If you've had any tricks that you've learned or you've learned something from this video, leave a comment below. I'd love to hear stories about it because this isn't a simple thing. If I've said anything wrong, please leave a comment below correcting me. I want to know so I can fix it and everybody else knows as well. I want to teach people to personally do it right, and you may actually help me learn something that I can bring back to my actual work. Be sure to give this video a thumbs up if I've helped you in some way. Make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon if you're interested in hearing more about coding tips, JavaScript tips, or just my life in general. And thanks for watching. Hey Google, set the living room lights to sky blue. Hey Google, set the table lights to white.